What is Old Frisian? As I mentioned in my video on where Frisian is spoken, West, East and North Frisian are all related through their common parent language, Old Frisian, and in this video we'll be finding out all about it. The oldest Frisian we have are some 20 runic inscriptions, the oldest seeming to date back to around the 5th century AD. Slightly later, we see single Frisian names and place names from the migration era. We also have a few words that are clearly Frisian in origin, even though they've been transmitted through the Frankish language into a Latin language text, the Lex Frisianum, written just before AD 800. A few glosses or translations of single words of Latin psalms can be found in Frisian from around the middle of the 12th century, though this amounts to only a few dozen words. The first texts we get written entirely in Frisian date from the late 13th century. This form of Frisian, found in the manuscripts and the earlier glosses, is what we call Old Frisian. Fans of Old English will note that Old Frisian is for the most part younger than Old English, where we have manuscripts surviving from the mid-7th century, about 600 years earlier. By the late 13th century, when we start seeing more Old Frisian, English is considered well into the Middle English period, with a whole host of Old French and Old Norse loanwords. It had also gone from being a synthetic language, using words endings to denote cases and make sense of who does what in a sentence, to being an analytic language, where who does what in a sentence is largely determined by word order rather than word endings. Some scholars then have argued that Old Frisian should really be Middle Frisian and line up chronologically with Middle English, Middle Dutch, etc. But other scholars disagreed. They pointed out that the 13th and 14th century Old Frisian looks more like Old English than Middle English, using those word endings to convey meaning with its case system. Even the latest Old Frisian manuscripts from the 15th and 16th centuries are more conservative than the surrounding Middle languages. Old Frisian is closely related to Old English, though exactly how and why are contested by scholars. By way of archaeological evidence, the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons who would go on to conquer large parts of eastern Britain came through and settled in Frisia before crossing the North Sea. Throughout much of the early Middle Ages, there was frequent trade and migration back and forth between Frisia and England, thus further strengthening ties. This relationship between English and Frisian involves certain sound changes shared by both languages, indicating either both a recent common ancestral language that underwent these changes or very close contact between speakers of the two. Both languages share many features with Old Saxon, the ancestor of the Low German language, though ultimately English and Frisian have more in common with one another. In fact, Old English and Old Frisian share so many sound changes with each other that we often talk of an Anglo-Frisian sub-branch of the West Germanic languages. Some of these sound changes include the loss of nasals and lengthening of preceding vowels in certain positions. So a Proto-Germanic form of rans loses the nasal n, and then the vowel a becomes longer, u, and gives English goose and West Frisian goos, while Dutch and German, which largely haven't had this change, keep gans and gans. Another example is with the word us and us compared with ons and uns. A change affecting Anglo-Frisian consonants is called palatalization, where the velar consonants like k and g, when before front vowels like e, a, become pronounced as ch, y, and j. This change is why English and Frisian have the initial ch sound in church and tjerke, while Dutch and German have kerk and kirche. The same is true for cheese and cheese. Interestingly, the ancestors of both church and cheese are early borrowings into West Germanic from Greek kuriakos and Latin caseus. There's a whole list of these sound changes that Old English and Old Frisian share, which I can make a video on if people are interested in seeing that. The vast majority of Old Frisian consists of legal texts, as well as around 1,100 charters and administrative documents. Many of the legal texts are variants of the same texts, though these handwritten manuscripts provide information on dialect differences and how the language and legal content changed over the years. It's also important that while the oldest Frisian manuscripts were written down at the dawn of the 13th century, much of the material within it is no doubt centuries older and was likely copied from older copies of now lost manuscripts. Some of these legal texts even mention the Vikings, and so might go as far back as the 11th century or perhaps even into the first millennium in form, though this is also the source of some debate. The vernacular language of the Old Frisian manuscripts fits into the same legal tradition as is seen in Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavia, where the spoken language of the people was chosen to record the law, as opposed to Latin, which we see elsewhere in continental Europe. Close study of some Old Frisian texts like this one also show that they were already recited before being put down on the manuscript page. Things like repetition and frequent alliteration, discourse markers, and being close to the human life world make clear the oral tradition of many such texts. Some of these Frisian laws have roots in the pagan past, as evidenced by the Latin Lex Frisionum, written around 800 AD, involving descriptions of what I interpreted as a cosmological sacrifice in its final chapter. Any overtly pagan traces are gone by the time Old Frisian texts are being written down in the 13th century, though the legal tradition still looks back to a broader Germanic set of laws involving the payment of weregild to avoid blood feuds and the swearing of legally binding oaths. Law was decided at the Thing, where the Skelta would lead the proceedings. The Asera, or law speaker, assisted the Skelta in providing the knowledge of which legal actions were required, though in different parts of Frisia, other figures could also be tasked with the remembrance and recitation of the law. There were always 12 Aseran, who, rather than being equivalent to a judge, were more like an advisory council who could suggest but not dictate proceedings. There was the Klagere, or claimant, and the Onsprekere, the complainant, and the Onthingere, the one who brought it to court, or literally to the thing. On the other side was the defendant, either the Haldere or the Sittere. To stop things getting out of hand, Frede, or peace, had to be observed during the legal proceedings. Everything occurred out in the open, and if needed, oaths would be sworn, in some cases requiring 5 extra men to swear to the character of the person in question. In cases where the claimant didn't comply with the defendant's denial, the right to ordeal might be chosen so that God could decide who was telling the truth. The kettlefang, literally kettle catch, involved retrieving a stone from a boiling kettle. If the scalded hand had healed sufficiently after several days, the Haldere was deemed innocent. Another ordeal was trial by combat, the type of weapons used and arena being carefully noted. The combatants were called kempa, a Frisian borrowing from Latin campio, which ultimately gives English champion through French. This ultimately goes back to the campus, or field, where duels were fought in Italic prehistory, so they're all related. In most cases though, the speaker would declare his judgment to the two parties who stood beside each other for the verdict. The speaker would then turn to find the party before him, forth finda, in the right, leaving the party urbek finda, found behind, in the wrong. Many of these older Germanic legal traditions began to change starting around 1300, where Roman and canonical law influenced Frisian law. A book printed in 1485 even has Latin glosses commenting on the Old Frisian legal texts with reference to learned Roman and canonical law, indicating this was becoming the norm at the time. In areas where Old Frisian was spoken, Frisian law appears to have been practiced, though there were some regional differences in both law and language. The most important thing place of all was under the gnarled roots of an ancient tree called the Uppstalsbaum, where representatives of the Frisian sea lambs met on the Tuesday after Whitsun every year to counter any threats to the Frisian freedom. Old Frisian is usually split into 2 dialect groups, Old East Frisian and Old West Frisian. Note though that Old West Frisian might better be called Central Frisian, because there was an extensive area west of here where Frisian was also spoken, notably in coastal Holland. So some scholars prefer to use the term Old East Frisian and Old Central Frisian. Old East Frisian can be further divided into Old Weser Frisian, recorded in the Resurgence manuscripts and named after the Weser River, and Old Ems Frisian, recorded in all the other manuscripts and named after the Ems River, around which many of them were produced. The problem with this geographical division is that practically all Old Frisian texts are from before 1400, and almost all of our Old West Frisian is from after that date. So are we dealing with a dialect difference or just different stages of the language's evolution? For this reason, some scholars prefer to use classical and post-classical Old Frisian. In general though, most scholars agree that there are some genuine dialect differences based on geography along these lines, and others that are more diachronic, changes that happened in stages to both. Here's a very quick overview of some of these differences, but rest assured I have a whole video coming out on the phonology, morphology and grammar of Old Frisian as a kind of part 2 in this video, in which I'll be showcasing in as much detail as I can the differences between the Old Frisian dialects as well as how Old Frisian changed over time. Our dialect constructions are largely based on where Old Frisian manuscripts and later charters were written. It's also important to recognise the blind spots for where we have no information. We know based on place names, some leftover dialect words and contemporary descriptions that Frisian was also spoken throughout Zeeland and Holland, the West Frisian area. But from this region we have absolutely no manuscripts. For the Dutch dialect of West Fries or Hollandic West Frisian, I'll be making a separate video on that in the future, as many people have asked. We also don't have any Old Frisian from the other extreme of the Frisian language area, the north. In the 8th century already, Frisians were migrating to Schleswig-Holstein and settling the islands there, including Helgoland. In the 10th or 11th century, a second wave departed from Friesland and brought new dialects to North Frisia. These two separate migrations, occurring some 3 centuries apart, are the reason why there are now 2 distinct dialect groupings in the North Frisian area between the islands and the mainland. But again, we have no manuscripts and so no idea what this kind of early North Frisian looked like. We can only work backwards from the modern variants. How much what is written in the manuscripts is an active reflection of what was being spoken in the area around the monastery is also up for debate. Throughout its existence, Old Frisian was influenced by various surrounding languages. To the south and southwest, Middle Low Franconian, also known as Middle Dutch, was an important language associated with the powerful counts of Flanders and Holland, as well as the bishopric of Utrecht. To the east and southeast, Middle Low German was an influential language spoken in a swath of today's northern Germany and into the Baltic states, owing to its prominent position in Hanse trade. Eventually, the area of Zeeland and Holland would switch to speaking Dutch, although in the latter, some Frisian-speaking pockets likely remained, perhaps as late as the 18th century. Similarly, all of Frisia east of the Lauwers, including the Dutch province of Groningen and the German Ostfriesland, except for at Zeeland, would adopt Low German. In both cases, the dialects in these formerly Frisian-speaking areas show a Frisian substrate, that is, a Frisian influence. As a result of Old Frisian's interaction with these languages, the modern Frisian languages also show influence from both Dutch and Low German to greater and lesser degrees. Partially as a result of these interactions, as well as language internal changes which affect every language in different ways, Old Frisian had become quite a different beast by the 16th century. In the 15th century, Frisia was a bit like the Wild West of feudal Europe. That's why the law was so important, as power there wasn't in the hands of powerful magnates and counts. 2 factions eventually arose that dragged Frisia into a huge civil war, spanning from Starum in the west to Resurgence in the east. On the one hand, the Skier, or Grey faction, was named after the grey habits of the Cistercian order, around whose monasteries the faction had formed. On the other hand, the Vetkepers, or fat buyers, were cattlemen, likely priding themselves on the large nature of their cows, or what they used to fatten them up. In any case, the conflict blazed for decades until external powers were requisitioned to restore order, including the neighbouring counts of Holland and the Dukes of Saxony. In 1498, Duke Albrecht of Saxony wrested control of the divided Frisia, at the same time replacing Old Frisian as the administrative language with Dutch and Low German. In 1528, Holy Roman Emperor Charles V acquired both West and East Frisia, as well as the Low Countries in their entirety, and the official language became Dutch. By 1540, Frisian had fallen down the rungs of the social ladder as a written language. A charter, in draft form only, survives from 1547, but after that, Frisian disappears entirely from the page. We know that the language continued in the spoken form, and that things were continually changing as they had been in the Old Frisian period. They're just invisible for linguists, or at least they aren't written down. The upper echelons of society switched to writing in Dutch, and society at large had already switched over to Low German in East Frisia. Migrations in this period from other parts of the Low Countries, particularly to urban areas, would see the emergence of Hollandic or Dutch dialects appearing in Friesland's cities, Staatsfriesk, thus relegating Frisian as a spoken medium to the countryside and among the common folk. With the end of the Frisians' political independence, the Old Frisian law also largely fell by the wayside. It was abolished by Albrecht of Saxony in Friesland following his takeover in 1498, although it continued in the Ommelanden around the city of Groningen until 1601. It lasted the longest in East Frisia, where some parts of Old Frisian law were still being observed in 1806, when Napoleon had them changed. As already mentioned though, the Frisian languages lived on, and in recent years, new life has also been blown into Old Frisian. In 2022, a collection of 6 Old Frisian legal manuscripts were recognised by UNESCO as essential memories of the world for the Netherlands. The entire collection has been digitised in high definition and is available to browse online, links in the description. Just last month in the National Library of Austria, 2 new fragments of Old Frisian were found dating to the 14th century. I'll be interviewing Han Nijdam, one of the foremost experts on Old Frisian law, to ask him about these new discoveries in the near future. If you'd like to find out way more about Old Frisian and meet other people enthusiastic about Old Germanic languages, you can sign up to the Old Frisian Summer School, hosted every other year by Oxford University and the Rijksuniversiteit Groningen. I'll either be there in person or at least delivering a lecture online for the summer 2025 instalment. Spearheaded by world experts in Old Frisian, Professor Johanneke Sietsema and Dr. Arne Popkema, I went in 2021 and 2023 and learned so much and met so many great people doing it. I would really highly recommend it. In fact, Dr. Arne Popkema was a big help in making this video, as were my lecture notes from the 2 summer schools that I attended. A big thank you to everyone who made this video possible. The various experts on Old Frisian already mentioned, everyone who voted in our community poll, and Elvis Roorstra and Baldus Draumar for the background music. I'll upload a part 2 of this video in a few weeks' time, giving an in-depth guide to the phonology, syntax, grammar, evolution and dialects of Old Frisian there. So until the next time, ik wie Hilbert en dit wie het Fries. Onthoor een keer en ontjen.